Thousand Oaks was the kind of place where life moved slow, until it didn't. It was the kind of town where secrets hid behind manicured lawns, and no one cared enough to notice when something went wrong. Kate Langston wasn't your typical 17-year-old girl. Sure, she had the wide-eyed dreams that most girls her age had, a future filled with ballet and stardom. But deep down there was a hunger to escape, to break free from the small apartment she shared with her mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Kate wanted more. So when a man like Thomas Grayson came into her life, promising her everything she never had, how could she resist? Thomas wasn't just a man, he was a force. 55 years old and sharp in the way only rich men can be, he had the kind of money that demanded respect. His real estate empire stretched across Los Angeles, his name whispered in boardrooms and cocktail lounges. But underneath the tailored suits and flashy watches was something darker. Thomas was a man on the edge, haunted by his recent divorce, looking for something, or someone, to fill the void. And that someone was Kate. Their first encounter was nothing short of orchestrated fate. Thomas spotted her practicing dance moves in the park, her body moving with a grace that captivated him. He watched from a distance, eyes locked on her, as if seeing something he had lost long ago. He approached her with the ease of a man who always got what he wanted. "Do you dance professionally?" His voice was smooth, like the expensive scotch he drank. Kate looked up, her sweat-drenched face blushing under his intense gaze. I'm hoping to one day." Thomas grinned, slipping a business card into her hand. "Call me. I might be able to help." From that moment on, Kate was sucked into Thomas's world, though she didn't realize it at first. The late-night dinners at swanky LA restaurants, the gifts, expensive clothes, jewelry, shoes, everything she could dream of. Kate had heard of men like Thomas, rich and powerful, who could make or break you with a snap of their fingers. But she never imagined she'd end up with one. And yet, here she was, falling into his orbit. Her friends from high school whispered behind her back, calling her a gold digger. But what did they know? They weren't the ones struggling to make ends meet. They weren't the ones watching their mother grind herself into the ground for a few dollars more. Kate didn't care what they thought. She had made it, or so she believed. But things weren't as perfect as they seemed. No one told her that being with a man like Thomas meant living under his rules. At first, the question seemed innocent enough. Where are you going? Who are you with? But soon, the questions became demands. He'd show up at her dance practice unannounced, insisting that she cancel plans to spend time with him. "I just want to make sure you're safe," he'd say, his eyes cold and unreadable. Kate wasn't stupid. She could see what was happening, but by the time she realized it, she was in too deep. Thomas had convinced her to move into one of his condos in downtown Los Angeles, far from her old life. Her mother, distant as ever, didn't seem to care that Kate was living with a man nearly 40 years older than her. "Just be careful," was all she said, before vanishing into another long shift. The condo was everything Kate had ever wanted, spacious, elegant, with a view that stretched out over the city. But it wasn't home. It was a cage, and Thomas held the key. One night, after yet another argument over where she had been, Thomas made her a proposition. "Marry me, Kate. You won't have to worry about anything ever again." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Marriage? She hadn't even turned 18 yet. But Thomas's gaze was unyielding, the diamond ring he slipped onto her finger, heavy with the weight of his control. Kate tried to resist, to tell him she needed more time, but his grip tightened. "I've given you everything," he hissed. "Don't you want this?" And in that moment, Kate realized the truth. She didn't have a choice. The wedding took place a month later, a small, private affair at an estate in Malibu. None of Kate's friends or family were invited. Thomas had arranged everything, down to the dress she wore and the vows she recited. It was all a show, a performance for his wealthy friends and associates, who watched her with thinly veiled judgment. After the ceremony, they moved into another one of Thomas's properties, a sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills. Kate could feel the walls closing in, the freedom she once had shrinking with each passing day. The cameras Thomas had installed around the house were no longer for security. They were there to watch her, to make sure she didn't stray. But Kate wasn't the kind of girl to sit still and be controlled. She still had fire left in her, and one night when Thomas was away on a business trip, she packed her bags and left. She didn't have a plan, just a hotel room booked in West Hollywood and a phone call to an old friend who owed her a favor. But she didn't make it far. By morning, Thomas had tracked her down, using the GPS he had secretly installed on her phone. When she opened the door to her hotel room, there he was, his face twisted in fury. "You think you can just leave me?" His voice was low, but it dripped with menace. "After everything I've done for you?" Kate backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, but Thomas was faster. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like iron. "You're mine, Kate. You belong to me." The confrontation ended with Kate being dragged back to the mansion, her escape attempt thwarted. But something had shifted in her. She could feel the fear gnawing at her, growing with each passing day. She had seen a side of Thomas she couldn't unsee, a darkness that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting to consume her. And then, the tension snapped. It happened during a cold December night. Thomas had returned from another business trip, his mood more volatile than ever. He accused Kate of seeing someone else, though she hadn't left the house in weeks. His voice grew louder, angrier, until he was shouting, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You're lying to me. I know you are." Kate tried to calm him down, to tell him he was being paranoid, but Thomas wasn't listening. His face twisted with rage, and before she knew what was happening, he lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. She cried out in pain, but Thomas didn't stop. His hands were around her throat, squeezing, and Kate realized with horror that he wasn't going to let go. She fought back with everything she had, scratching, kicking, anything to break free. But Thomas was stronger, and as the room started to spin, Kate's vision blurred. But it wasn't over yet. Kate's vision flickered as she struggled beneath Thomas's weight. His hands gripped her throat with a strength she had never seen before, his face twisted with a crazed look of obsession. Panic surged through her body. She flailed, her nails scratching deep into his skin, but Thomas didn't even flinch. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wild now, filled with something terrifying. She knew this was it. This was how she was going to die, and in that moment a surge of desperation overtook her. Using the last bit of strength she could muster, Kate kicked hard, managing to push him off balance just enough to wriggle free from his grasp. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for air, her throat burning. Thomas was already back on his feet, his eyes locked on her like a predator ready to pounce. This time, though, Kate wasn't just running. She was fighting for her life. She dashed towards the kitchen, adrenaline kicking in, her fingers fumbling for anything she could use to defend herself. Thomas was right behind her, shouting something, his voice distorted by the ringing in her ears. She didn't hear the words, only the rage behind them. Her hand found the cold steel of a knife on the counter. Without thinking, she spun around, holding it out in front of her as Thomas lunged at her again. The blade sliced through the air, and before she knew it, it had sunk deep into his side. He let out a guttural roar, more of shock than pain, and staggered back. But it didn't stop him. Thomas charged at her again, this time with a renewed fury. Kate slashed wildly, driven by pure survival. The knife caught him across the chest, blood spraying onto the pristine white walls of the kitchen. Still, he came at her, relentless, as though the pain only fueled his rage. They stumbled into the living room, knocking over a glass coffee table in the process. Shards of glass scattered across the floor, glittering like stars under the dim light. Kate's back hit the wall, the knife still in her trembling hand. Thomas's bloodied figure loomed in front of her, his breath ragged but his eyes still burning with that terrifying obsession. "You're mine," he growled, his voice hoarse as he reached for her. Kate reacted instinctively. She plunged the knife into his chest again, this time deeper, twisting it with all the force she had left. Thomas gasped, his body jerking in shock. For a moment, everything went still. The air seemed to freeze. Kate stood there, breathing heavily, her hands slick with his blood. And then Thomas collapsed to the floor. Kate stared down at him, the reality of what she had done slowly sinking in. Blood pooled around his body, soaking into the expensive Persian rug. She stumbled back, dropping the knife, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. The house was deathly silent now, the only sound the distant hum of the refrigerator. She could feel the bile rising in her throat, her mind reeling from the horror of it all. Thomas Grayson was dead. She had killed him. But there was no time to grieve, no time to think. Her survival instincts kicked in. She needed to get out, now. The mansion that had once felt like a cage was now a crime scene, and she was standing at the center of it. Kate ran upstairs, frantically grabbing her belongings. Her hands shook as she shoved clothes into a bag, her mind racing with panic. She knew the security cameras had likely captured everything. There was no way to erase the footage. Thomas had made sure the system was impenetrable, but she had no choice. She had to leave before anyone found out what happened. With her bag slung over her shoulder, Kate ran down the stairs, her feet slipping on the blood-streaked floor as she darted for the front door. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The sight of Thomas's lifeless body would haunt her forever, but she had to focus on escaping now. Her hand fumbled with the lock, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she flung the door open and bolted into the night. The cold December air hit her like a wall, but she kept running, her mind spinning. She needed to get as far away from that house as possible. She couldn't go to the police, not yet. They would see her as the villain, a gold digger who killed her older husband for his money. No one would believe it was self-defense. No one would understand the months of control and terror she had endured. She ran to her car parked at the edge of the long driveway, her heart pounding as she fumbled with the keys. As she started the engine, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It was a text from one of Thomas's associates. "Thomas told me you two had a fight. Is everything okay? I'm coming over." Panic surged through her veins. He couldn't come here. Not now. Kate threw her phone onto the passenger seat and slammed her foot on the gas, speeding away from the mansion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away, fast. She drove for hours, her mind numb, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see flashing lights any minute. The blood on her hands had dried by now, but she could still feel its stickiness, still see the crimson streaks on her skin. As dawn approached, Kate found herself in a small coastal town miles away from Thousand Oaks. She pulled into a desolate motel, parking in the shadows. Her body ached from exhaustion, but sleep was impossible. She sat in the dark, staring at her blood-streaked reflection in the rearview mirror. What had she done? She had escaped Thomas's clutches, but now she was trapped in something even worse. She was a murderer. Days passed, and the news of Thomas Grayson's death spread like wildfire. His associates were quick to cover for him at first, assuming Kate was some runaway gold digger. But when they found the footage from the security cameras, everything changed. By the end of the week, Kate's face was plastered across every news station in Los Angeles. The media painted her as the young, manipulative wife who had brutally murdered her wealthy husband. They didn't know the truth, but Kate knew that didn't matter. They were after her now. There was no going back.